So hi, thank you.
Hi.
First of all, thank you for agreeing to do this
My pleasure.
brilliant presentation.
My pleasure.
And so the first thing that I wanted to ask you is, would you be able to provide an overview of your research? Like, what is your topic? How did you approach it? Yeah.
Sure. So overall, my research focuses on trying to understand the determinants of growth, economic growth, poverty alleviation, structural transformation at the local level as a way of trying to understand these processes more broadly in the world. And the way I do that is by putting together a lot of very high spatial resolution data in India to study these things across India's 600,000 villages and 5,000 towns over time, to understand everything from the role of infrastructure to natural resources to politics and so on. And what my co-authors and I got interested in this paper was there had been all this cutting edge work coming out in the US and in some other rich countries about intergenerational mobility, which is the extent to which the circumstances of my birth, the status of my parents, matter for my own economic outcomes. And we wanted to study this in a place like India, which has undergone huge growth over the last 40 years, massive transformations both culturally and economically, but actually not that much known about intergenerational mobility. And the challenge in developing countries is that they often don't have the kind of rich income data that researchers can get access to in the United States and in other rich countries. And so you have to work with education data, and what we realized is that to do a lot of these rank-based methods for intergenerational mobility, using education data, we needed to develop some new methods. So we wrote this methods paper first on getting signal from interval data, where we try to improve upon Minsky and Tamer in some ways that are appropriate for this setting, and also for mortality, which is another topic that we study in that paper. And then we applied these methods to India to try to examine how has intergenerational mobility, again, the ability to kind of be born at the bottom but move up in society, how has that changed across time? How does that differ across groups? How does that differ across space?
What do you think are the implications for public policy of your findings?
So one potential implication, and this is really speculative because we haven't done the research yet, is that these affirmative action programs really matter. There is some nice evidence on that out there. And it is certainly striking that the groups that are catching up with upper castes are the ones that are targeted by these affirmative action programs. In India, they have the largest affirmative action policies in the world. They target historically disadvantaged groups with reserved government jobs, reserved spots in educational institutions, scholarships, and so on. None of these programs are targeted at Muslims. And so maybe that's why they're sort of falling behind. And so some people have written calling for extending these reservations and other programs out to Muslims as well. Can't say that yet because we don't have the evidence yet, but we're working on kind of putting that together. Another possibility is that there's discrimination. If there's discrimination in the provision of government goods and services, like the placement of schools, again, we need to actually do the research on that. But if that's the case, then what I would argue for is putting into place policies that ensure that these public goods and services are distributed much more equally across space, and that there's not the discretion to kind of give them to certain areas and not to others.
Okay, and finally, you kind of already answered, but what is your plan for future research on this topic?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the two really big things are exactly that. Affirmative action on the one hand, and explaining, there's some great work by Gaurav Khanna and others. Guillaume Cassan has some nice work on this, showing that affirmative action programs do work, that people get more education, both because of the direct educational benefits, but also the incentive effects. This is what Gaurav's work shows on like sort of future generations that hope to get those better jobs that are now being reserved for them. So the question is, how is this affecting mobility, which is really focusing on the bottom? We need to answer that question. They haven't done that. So that's one thing that we want to do. And then the other thing is to really look at discrimination. Discrimination is a very, very difficult thing to test for. It's very hard to say when you see differences across people or across groups that that's been the result of discrimination and not other things. Culture, fertility, I mean, people bring up a ton of different potential differences. Geography, it's hard to say that it's discrimination, but we're working on trying to do some research that's really focusing in on provision of public goods at the local level and characterizing the population composition at the local level and seeing whether there are disparities in how these goods are distributed across space.
Thank you for joining us. Yeah.